Good evening, everyone. Nice to see the auditorium so full. My name is Jessica Ludwig. I'm Deputy Director here at the Morgan, and it is truly my great pleasure this evening to introduce tonight's speaker, our very own Colin B. Bailey. Colin is the Katharine Colin, the Katharine J. Rayner Director of the Morgan Library Museum, is celebrating his 10th year at the Morgan, having arrived in 2015. A renowned scholar of 18th and 19th French art and a great specialist of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, he was made an officier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in 2010, and in 2020 was awarded the Prix du Rayonnement de la Langue et de la Littérature by the Académie Française. As director, he steered the Morgan through the very, very tough times of the pandemic. He spearheaded the exterior restoration of the historic library and created the new Morgan Garden that I hope you all have visited. He grew the ambition and diversity of our programming and collections, and he launched a new strategic plan for the institution as it moved into its second century. He is also the curator of Renoir Drawings, which opened to the public just today. And tonight, he will explore how Renoir used paper to test his ideas, plan compositions, interpret landscape and figures, and all of that will help provide insights into the artist's creative process. Colin pays close attention to every exhibition at the Morgan, reading each label, scrutinizing every checklist, reviewing exhibition designs. But this project, this exhibition, is his very own labor of love. So you are in for a treat. One of the great perks of my job is that I get the opportunity to hear Colin speak frequently, often in front of an original work of art or literature, an Emily Dickinson poem, a 14th century medieval psalter, a Rembrandt sketch, a Peter Hujar contact sheet, the full, incredible range of the Morgan's collections. And as he gathers people around and carefully leans over each precious object, I will never cease to admire his infectious curiosity, his subtle mind, and his all-encompassing graciousness. And with that, I give you Colin B. Bailey.
Good evening, everyone. Jessica, thank you so much. I'm delighted that so many people are here on a Friday evening, and I encourage you, if you haven't seen the exhibition, to go and see it after we conclude, and then to see it again and again. After Renoir's death in Cagnes-sur-Mer on the 3rd of December 1919, anecdotes circulated in the press that he paid so little attention to his drawings, and I'm quoting, then instead of newspaper, he stoked the fire with them. Such was his lack of concern that the lighting of his stove unfortunately consumed many of these bits of paper. Jean Renoir recalled his father ordering Gabrielle Renard, the housekeeper, to empty his portfolios in the fire. It's so silly to keep all that stuff. A dealer might try to sell them, Renoir remarked. I think they're pretty, protested Gabrielle, but she had to obey him, and the entire contents would go into the stove, except for 1 or 2 watercolors, which she would manage to hide behind a piece of furniture. Now, these images that I've shown you are absolutely fake. They are made by AI. It's my first efforts at composing on that platform, but they give you a sense of, in some ways, the absurdity of these tales, but these tales were current in the aftermath of Renoir's death. In fact, these outlandish stories are quite quickly debunked. Renoir valued his drawings and watercolors. As an example here, he valued them as precious documents that were part of his research. These are terms that he used. In spring 1888, he reminded the artist Bette Morisot to look after a watercolor that he had left behind during a visit. "Don't lose it," he wrote to her. "I did not forget it, but it was raining, and so it might have been damaged." It is the case, however, that while Renoir's works on paper form a considerable part of his work, of his oeuvre in general, his drawings in graphite and charcoal, black chalk, pen and ink and brush, sanguine, pastel, and watercolor, and these examples are all in the exhibition upstairs, it is the case that this group of his work, this corpus of his work, has remained somewhat uncharted territory. Renoir's earliest biographers were in agreement that he drew constantly and from an early age. His son, Jean Renoir, recorded his father saying that he never let a day go by without making some sort of scribble, even if only a drawing of an apple in a notebook. "It's so easy to lose one's hand." These are quotes from these are Renoir's reminiscences. Jean Renoir also wrote that his father began to draw furiously after his first communion, so at around the age of 8. And there is poignancy and, I think, authenticity in the anecdote about Renoir's final hours, recounted by Matisse to his wife 2 weeks after the artist's death. We see Matisse on the left. That afternoon, Matisse wrote, Renoir had asked for a crayon and some paper so that he could draw a vase for Coco, Claude Renoir, his youngest son, who we see on the right, who was training to become a ceramicist. Drawing is the probity of art. To draw does not mean simply to reproduce contours. Drawing does not consist merely of line. Drawing is also expression, the inner form, the plane, modeling. See what remains after that. These words were written by Ingres, and the drawing I'm showing you is one of the Morgan's many wonderful sheets by Ingres, Frau Reinhold and her daughters. And this statement that Ingres made and that was published is something that Renoir would certainly have been familiar with. Drawing as the probity of art. Any painter trained in the French system from the 1860s on would also have been familiar with this idea and seen it as a sort of standard core belief, regardless of what form his or her later production would take. But unlike Pissarro and Degas and Cézanne, Renoir made drawings and studies only intermittently. Until the mid-1880s, he rarely used them in their traditional form as preparatory studies for figure paintings and portraits. While there are records of Renoir's early academic drawings, such as this one, made between 1857 and 1860, and the occasional watercolor and pen and ink drawing from the 1860s, these are outliers, because for this period, between 1860 and 1875, there are very few works on paper by him in any medium. As a founding Impressionist, who produced figure paintings of great originality between 1874 and 1875, Renoir more or less abandoned drawing as a preparatory tool. It was only his so-called crisis of Impressionism in the mid-1880s and paintings such as Maternity and The Great Bathers that we see here that led him to reevaluate the role of drawing and its various purposes, functions, and formats. And from then on, drawings in all techniques, as well as in reproductive media, such as etching and color lithography, remained an integral part of his output, so from the 80s to 1919. In January 1886, after a visit to Renoir's studio, where she saw a group of red and white chalk drawings of Maternity, and this is in our exhibition, the artist Bette Morisot confided to her journal, Renoir showed me a whole series done from the same model with about the same movement. He is a draftsman of the first order, and it would be interesting to show all these preparatory drawings for a painting to the public, which generally imagines that the Impressionists work in a very casual way. And as I've noted, Renoir worked on paper in a variety of medium, all of which are exhibited upstairs. His work includes drawings in pencil, black chalk, and charcoal, in pen and ink and wash, in pastel, in red chalk, and watercolor. He works occasionally on a large scale in red chalk heightened by white, and he is a passionate painter in watercolor. The most recent survey suggests that Renoir made maybe 800 works on paper, which might be a little low as a number, and this would include 100 watercolors, 150 pastels, 100 red chalk drawings, with the remainder in graphite, black chalk, charcoal, and pen and ink. So he's, if we say maybe 1,000 drawings we have access to, and he is known to have made around 4,000 paintings. None of Renoir's early sketchbooks survive. His earliest, dating from 1857, was taken apart in the mid-20th century, and 21 pages of this book were given us to the National Gallery of Canada. These are, as works of art, rather miserable pages, but they are our first insight into Renoir's training as a draftsman. And here we see, for instance, how he is copying a print after Fragonard in the drawing on the left. The only other notebook that we know from sketchbook that was known was one that he used in 1881 when he went to Algiers and to Italy, and that book has been happily preserved in facsimile, but the individual pages are lost. So the information we have for Renoir for his drawings can be compared to Monet, who is thought to have made around 500 drawings. But his graphic output is far less than both Pissarro or Cézanne. Pissarro is thought to have made at least 3,000 drawings, and Cézanne 2,000, which include 1,200 pencil studies and 700 watercolors. Drawing, nonetheless, was fundamental for Renoir's early training, where his family wanted him to become a decorator in the porcelain factory of Sèvres, which was going to be a step up from his father's profession as a gentleman's tailor. Renoir learned to draw at the Free Municipal Drawing School in Paris's 3rd arrondissement. He attended evening classes 3 times a week between 8 and 10 p.m. As his brother Edmond remembered in 1879, when Renoir was in his late 30s, his brother recorded, armed with his cardboard portfolio that was bigger than he was, Renoir attended the free drawing school. And like all students at this free school, Renoir would have been provided with pattern books to copy, and some of his early sketches after these patterns have survived. But he abandons his hope to become a painter at Sèvres, and in his late teens, he worked in various industrial trades as a designer of blinds and a decorator of cafes. His ambitions to become a fine artist are really documented in a series of elaborate compositional drawings that he makes between January and July 1860, before he enters the studio of the artist Charles Gleyre. And then he goes on to sit exams for the prestigious Imperial École des Beaux-Arts. So this drawing, for example, showing Homer and the shepherds, is dated 11th of January 1860. And it gives you a sense of the track that Renoir was on as an artist starting out. He was working in a very classic, traditional academic mode, and we also see his other drawings and copies after classical groups. This rather muddy slide, my apologies, of a dated drawing after the famous Laocoon series. So he's immersed in the classical antiquities that he could see at the Louvre. He's a little less irreverent than his friend Basile, who does a drawing of the Venus de Milo smoking a pipe. But he is nonetheless on that track. He is accepted as a student of the École des Beaux-Arts, and for 2 years, He performed well above average in the exams that they had to take, and he renewed his copyist's license so he could work at the Louvre, where he worked until 1864, and his preference seems to have been for the ground floor antiquities galleries, which he claimed were often were easy to find and nearly always empty. And we have a drawing in the exhibition copying the Borghese Mars. Among his early student pieces that show his virtuosity is a quite unexpected pen and ink drawing of a male skeleton that is hyperrealist in its accuracy and attention to detail. Now, in Renoir's, jumping forward a decade, when Renoir now starts out as a painter and a confident painter and a great painter, his canvases of the 1870s and 1880s did not require him to look to preparatory drawing or sketches in any way. He preferred to draw directly in paint and to make radical revisions on the canvas where necessary. As the art collector and historian Théodore Duret noted in 1885, so really just 10 years after these works were made, the Impressionists had liberated themselves from the rules of purely conventional draftsmanship. They established a manner of painting broadly and spontaneously and in bright colors. And this is the hallmark of Impressionism, and it always bears reminding ourselves that initially this type of painting, both its subject matter, its scale, its handling, its facture, its colorism, this was profoundly controversial and destabilizing at the beginning of these artists' careers. Nowhere is Renoir's abandonment of preparatory drawing more visible than in an example like this, the Promenade from the Frick collection, painted in 1875-6. This is a beautiful full-length painting of a young governess shepherding her two lovely charges who are dressed for the winter in matching costumes. Now, Renoir did not write or explain very much about this picture. It was called La Promenade, the walk, the promenade, when it was exhibited in 1876. However, when we examined the painting through infrared reflectography, we discovered something quite unexpected. If you look at the upper left of the screen, you will see the detail of an older woman in a hat and a veil with an attendant, less well-dressed, next to her. And to just make that clearer, I'm showing you this detail. So what we see is that Renoir, having planned this composition, initially to have more figures, initially perhaps for the figure on the left to be the mother of 3 young daughters, 2 young and 1 less young, he changes his mind and returns to a canvas without paints either of those figures out to give a clearer, more balanced and more airy composition. If he'd done drawings for this, he might not have had to do that. But he was not using drawings or sketches at this time. In the decade of the 1870s, one colored medium drawing medium did remain congenial to Renoir, and that is his drawings in pastel, which are among the most beautiful objects of his work and the hardest to borrow. His genre scenes of everyday life, and his portraits in that decade are an essential part of his production. And we're very lucky to be able to borrow a handful, and certainly this pastel drawing of Elizabeth Maître from the Albertina is one of the great pleasures of the exhibition. At that period, as the administrator Charles Blanc noted in his Grammar of the Arts, published in 1867, in this period, pastel, with its fugitive effects, was particularly well suited, and I'm quoting, to the brilliant tints of a young girl, the flesh of a child. And so Renoir is using this medium exactly as it would have been expected to be used by the more official art establishment. And it was indeed the children as well as the wives of Renoir's well-to-do patrons in this decade who provided the majority of sitters for his pastel portraits. At the Salon of 1879, the 3-year-old Paul Charpentier, son of Georges and Marguerite Charpentier, his great patrons. This pastel was shown at the Salon, as well as other pastels of children of his close supporters. And in 1879, Renoir shows 30 works at a gallery of the publishing house La Vie Moderne in the center of Paris, around which the largest work is a painting at the Art Institute Chicago that we see here of the acrobats, but he also showed several pastels of well-known figures, celebrities in the Parisian firmament, such as the poet Théodore de Banville, the actress Jeanne Saint-Marie. And Renoir was also attentive to the potential market for some of these pastels. In a letter that was written in 1879 or 1880 to the owner of this work, the female nude, he wrote, "You'd be most kind to send me the pastel of a torso that you have at home. A gentleman is pursuing me to acquire it and has made me a very good offer. I know you would not want me to miss such an opportunity." The pastel was returned to Renoir, the buyer flaked out, and Renoir kept hold of this for another 20 years. But it gives you a sense that he's attentive to the possible markets for these works. Now, going to 1881, in 1881, the Impressionist great sub-champion, the dealer Charles Duhamel, began acquiring works by Pissarro, Cézanne, Monet, and Renoir at a regular basis. He was also able to send Renoir some money on request. And Renoir, we know, sold Duhamel a number of pastels at prices between 150 and 500 francs. So a small market nonetheless, but a market nonetheless. And in these years, between 1877 and 1883, Renoir also had a thriving career as an illustrator, producing drawings in pen and ink, black chalk, and crayon for various journals and publications such as La Vie Moderne. Ironically, for one who lamented the loss of the traditional trades to industrialization, the growth of the illustrated art press was made possible by advances in mechanization, notably through photography-based gillotage, invented in the 1870s by Charles Gillot. This photomechanical process enabled the transfer of drawings onto a zinc plate coated with a light, sensitive ground that preserved its original appearance and preserved the drawing itself. Renoir did not particularly enjoy drawing on Gillot paper, and these are two examples. The example on the left is a drawing on Gillot paper. He didn't particularly enjoy working in this way. "They forced upon us for our drawings," he wrote to one of his dealers, "a paper that required the use of a scraper to render the whites. I could never get used to it, and nor did such work pay very well. We were supposed to be paid out of future profits, which meant we didn't see a sou." So no fewer than 14 drawings for reproduction have been documented by Renoir. Many of these served to illustrate a short story by his brother Edmond Renoir. As an example on the left, we see a drawing of, after a painting, the dance at Bougival, and we see how it appears on the printed page. And there's a small section in the exhibition to show some of these drawings in the actual volumes that they were meant for. These are two examples of works on Gillot paper. If you look very closely, you'll see a sort of ribbed surface a textured surface of the paper that Renoir and Monet, who also worked in this area, in this field, did not particularly appreciate, but they made very good work of it nonetheless. And so between 1879 and 1884, many of Renoir's drawings were used to illustrate stories in La Vie Moderne. Now, while he would occasionally also make drawings towards paintings, beginning to do this in 1883 with these examples of dance in the city that are in the exhibition, in many cases, some of his most accomplished drawings were for after the painting had been completed, to be used as compositions for this journal. And these two examples, one from the National Gallery in Washington, the second from Denver, give us a sense of how carefully he prepared these commissions and how, in a way, how masterful his command of pen and ink and brush and wash is. In the early 1880s, Renoir later recalled to his dealer that he had reached an impasse. I had come to the end of Impressionism, he recalled, and realized that I knew neither how to paint or to draw. Between 1884 and 1887, Renoir's manner of painting and drawing underwent a thorough re-evaluation in technique, in style, and in subject matter. He absorbed or reabsorbed the lessons of antiquity, he looked back at Raphael and Ingres more closely, and he, in general, abandoned subjects of modern urban Parisian life in favor of a concentration on the female nude. The nude, he informed Bette Morisot, was one of the indispensable forms of art. Now, his principal examples of this new manner of both painting and of working towards painting through drawing, is the subject of Maternity, or breastfeeding, 2 versions in paint, and several wonderful drawings in red chalk, large drawings in red chalk and white chalk. But beyond this, the Great Bathers from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which he considered his masterpiece, his œuvre maîtresse. And for the first time in his career, Renoir would make large preparatory drawings in red and white chalks of the same scale as the work themselves, in addition to other numerous studies in smaller format. And as was noted 40 years ago by John House and our co-curator Anne Distel, during these years, Renoir focused on the relationship of drawing to painting, of contour to color. This was the only phase in his career in which he made such complex preparations and gave such importance to drawing. Renoir's paintings and drawings of Maternity, done in 1885 and 1886, mark the transformation of this process and introduce a new linear, Ingres-esque, Ingriste style. In the late summer of 1885, Renoir started work on a painting of Aline, his companion, soon to be his wife, and their first child, Pierre, in front of a rented cottage in La Roche-Guyon, a village on the Seine, 60 kilometers northwest of Paris. And it showed the young country mother suckling, breastfeeding her impeccably attired little boy, who we see here. Aline and her chubby infant were likely among the first studies for this. This is a wonderful drawing we sadly could not borrow from Toronto. And it was followed by 2 large vertical and red and white drawings of the same dimension. So a whole suite, a whole series of drawings of Aline and Jean and Pierre. The final painting, which we see in the exhibition, was executed in thin oils on a fine primed canvas and in an almost wash-like technique. He started following this first painting. Renoir made a second version with an adorable cat added in the lower right, and he then continued to work on slightly smaller version, and he continued nonetheless, even though he was very familiar with this type of composition, he continued to make drawings in red and white chalk that are quite large. And in one of these, you see on the right, the contours of the child are almost obliterated by the aureole of white chalk around the figures. While Bette Morisot was moved by the gracefulness and subtlety, her words, of some of these large drawings when she saw them in Renoir's studio in January 1886, Renoir's primary dealer, Charles Duhamel, did not share her enthusiasm at all. As the Impressionist Pissarro informed his son in July 1886, Durand has seen the Renoirs. He does not like his new manner in the least, not at all. Nonetheless, Renoir continued to develop a style and method that would imbue the coloristic modeling, the freedom of brushwork, and the heightened luminosity of Impressionism with a greater rigor and structure achieved primarily through drawing. And here the central example is the Great Bathers, from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is making its first appearance in New York since it was acquired by the museum in 1926. And it was the gift to the Morgan in 2018 by the estate of Drew Heinz, this large preparatory drawing in red and white chalks for the bathers that, in a way, set in motion the research and preparation for this exhibition. I'm quite confident that I shall knock Raphael off his pedestal and that the population of 1887 will be amazed and astonished. This is Renoir's jaunty note to a friend in October 1886, and it was likely written just as he was about to embark on the painting of the Great Bathers. The large canvas would be the centerpiece of his submission to an exhibition in another dealer's gallery, Georges Petit's gallery on the Rue de Sèze. And it was in this exhibition in May 1887, to this exhibition Renoir would also send two new paintings, two new works in his new manner, Return from the Fields, from the Fitzwilliam, which we have in the exhibition, and A Girl with the Rose, a pastel that is also here. So alongside these two smaller works, the centerpiece of the exhibition was The Great Bathers, and it was listed in the catalogue as an experiment in decorative painting. His friend Pissarro remained unconvinced. I appreciate how much effort Renoir has put into all this, and it's all well and good to want to move forward, but he has limited his concerns to the line, and his figures are detached from each other without any consideration of their relationship. Renoir's primary dealer, Dion Rouel, perhaps luckily for Renoir, was in America at the time and so did not see the exhibition, but he was informed by Monet, Renoir has painted a superb picture of bathers, not understood by everybody, but by many. As his point of departure for this work, Renoir looked to François Giraudon's lead frieze of frolicking nymphs, sculpted between 1669 and 1671 for the basin, the rectangular basin of the Allée des Marmousets in the Garden of Versailles. The splashing figure, as you'll see, is almost a direct quote from this frieze. Later in life, Renoir had recalled to Vollard, his dealer, that he had floundered for 3 years working on this painting. This was a time of trial and error and fresh starts. Now, it's unlikely that Renoir was engaged on this one picture for 3 years. But his recollection of trial and error and fresh starts is helpful in guiding us through the genesis of the composition and through a group of drawings and a painting of various formats and different media made between 1885 and 1887. So, between autumn 1886 and spring 1887, Renoir worked on 2 large paintings of the bathers. The first version was left incomplete, and you can see is still in a sketchy manner, and was later owned by Ambroise Vollard, and it's seen in the back of this the photograph of him. But the Great Bathers itself, the painting itself, which is in Cagnes today, remained unfinished. A starting point for this first canvas and for the second one is a beautiful watercolor in Orsay's collection, a sheet of studies. Look at the central vignette of the young bather resting on her left arm, and you see that figure has been kept almost unchanged throughout all the versions of the final paintings. But if you look closely on the vignette at the upper left of the sheet, and I've turned the sheet around 90 degrees, so you now see it in the second sheet on the lower left-hand part, you will see the first idea, perhaps, for the composition, which represents a set of 3 nudes, and it's hard to see, but 3 nudes in a beautiful landscape with blue water in the background and a verdant tree as well. The reclining figure at the left is the most clearly defined. In the center, you can make out a standing nude who faces the viewer, and on the right, seen from behind, a bather who bends over and reveals her back to us. When and where might this drawing have been made? Renoir, Aline Charigot, and their 16-month son Pierre spent the summer of 1886 in La Chapelle Saint-Briac in northern Brittany. The landscape, the Breton landscape, was a revelation to Renoir, and he had decided to work very closely from it in watercolors and studies. I am making drawings and watercolors, he informed his dealer in summer 1886, so that there will be no shortage of material for me to use this winter. And since Renoir, like Manet, generally needed a deadline of an exhibition to produce large, ambitious compositions, it would seem that he started working in earnest on the Great Bathers once he returned to Paris in the autumn of 1886. We can identify two discrete phases in the process towards completion. The first, a large preparatory drawing from the Musée d'Orsay in black, red, and white chalks. And look at the middle figure, particularly with her raised left arm, which is precisely preparatory for the first sketchy composition that was left unfinished. Keeping your eye on this middle figure, in both drawing and painting, you will see that she is slim-waisted and that both of her feet, her legs and feet, are hanging over the edge of the sort of rock where they're sitting, with almost touching the water. This would change. So after stopping work on this first iteration for reasons we do not know, Renoir begins the work in earnest that will lead to the Great Bathers. And he concentrates on the first two figures only. In the large drawing at the Morgan and in the second drawing at the Harvard museums that are brought together here, he works on these two figures intensively. He has moved the first figure's right hand somewhat further away from her face, and he is really thinking about the way that the central figure will be represented. This is also the case in a preparatory drawing that we have from Harvard that shows all three figures. Now, the Morgan's drawing was likely the first of the really grand preparatory drawings for the final composition. Following its completion, Renoir turned to a second drawing where he worked more intensively on the middle figure. Renoir had not yet settled on the astonishing motif of the middle figure drying off with a towel as she sits on the banks of the river. In the Morgan drawing, the figure still retains all of her, is really seated without any of the arm movement that we see later on. Now, unlike the Morgan's drawing, the Harvard drawing on the right has been cut down, and you can see that the right foot of the seated figure has been cropped. It appears miraculously in the second drawing that we brought together from a private collection in Paris, and you can see that initially the drawing from Harvard must have been even wider. On this vertical sheet, Renoir then worked a little later on the standing figure, the splashing figure, as well as the two figures behind her. And in a way, that I think this drawing, beautiful drawing, relates to a slightly different phase in the process of finishing the Great Bathers. The argument for putting the Morgan's drawing at a slightly earlier date than the Harvard's drawing was supported by a recent discovery in the Archives Renoir. As Renoir's career takes off, he begins to experience the challenge of forgeries. And in the 1900s, his dealer, Ambroise Vollard, has him sign photographs of drawings or paintings that, in a way, serves as authentication of Renoir's painting of them. Now, what we found then in these archives is an early photograph of our drawing. And if you look closely, you'll see that the seated figure in the middle has an arm that is lifted up. and that is, seems to be, in a way, placed higher than the figures. This is completely covered by white chalk in our drawing. I'm just trying to focus you so you can see what we're talking about. And after Vollard's visit to Cagnes a second time, he takes a second photograph of the refinished drawing. So we know that part of this drawing was, in a way, I don't want to say doctored by Renoir, but at least improved by Renoir, because in the first iteration, the seated figure in the middle shows 3 different possibilities for how this arm is going to be placed. It didn't matter, the drawing didn't sell, but it was Vollard's effort to try, I think, to create a more finished composition in red and white chalk, and Renoir's willingness to do so. But what of this third figure, the drawing from the Art Institute of Chicago of the splashing girl, which is one of the most beautiful drawings in the exhibition? And it's executed in a different technique. The figure was initially outlined in black chalk over a base layer of white, with the flesh tones modulated in red and black chalk. There's a degree, they were stumped and blended, and there's a degree of finish, but also of painterliness that is not quite apparent in the earlier preparatory studies. Nor does this figure exactly reprise the gesture of the splashing girl in the painting. It's another curious issue, if you look in the Chicago drawing at the top left, is the detail of what looks like an arm and a piece of a tree. And this goes back to the very first idea of the seated woman who is in the middle of the composition, whose left arm is attached to a branch. So we don't really know what that detail is doing in the Chicago drawing, but I think it's pretty clear to say that this is a different type of drawing than any of the other preparatory works on paper. And this work also introduces a final stage in Renoir's art, his concentration on the female nude, where he makes many, many drawings, autonomous or preparatory, of standing bathers in a variety of chalks. He told me, Bette Morisot notes, that for him the nude was one of the indispensable forms of art. Less reverentially, Renoir's friend and collector, the younger artist Jacques-Émile Blanche, described these beautiful nude drawings as Venuses on the banks of the Seine. And so there's a sense both of the classical tradition, but also always in Renoir, a feeling of a living Parisienne, of someone of our time rather than from antiquity. Along with his nudes, his work on paper comprises a large section of watercolors, done as notations, done as documents, inspired by travel with his family, his ability to move around different parts of France, but not necessarily as preparation for paintings, for specific paintings. He wrote enthusiastically to one of his patrons about the beauty of Martigues in the Côte d'Azur, where we think this watercolor was made. "It has made me work," he wrote, "in watercolor, which will prove extremely useful as I have now familiarized myself with this type of boarding school painting, cette peinture de jeune pensionnaire." So in fact, it's a jokey letter, but this is not seen necessarily as the most serious avocation of the painter. But for Renoir, it becomes an important part of his repertory. As Pissarro reminded his son around the same time, in 1891, watercolor was not especially difficult, but it's a good medium to help one's memory, especially for those fleeting effects. And Renoir's watercolors of the 1890s record sort of idyllic, if unpopulated, holiday spots where in Brittany or in the Mediterranean, they are calm and sunlit. Very rarely do we see any people in them, and nor does he particularly concern himself with topography and site. A beautiful watercolor at the Getty Museum that we did not borrow is rare in being both dated and annotated by Renoir as having been done in Pont-Aven in Brittany. He was enthusiastic about these Breton villages, just as he was enthusiastic about the Côte d'Azur. And in a letter to Berthe Morisot, which we have here, he draws the whole region that he wants her to visit. He says, "It is the most beautiful country in the world. One has Italy, Greece, and the Batignolles, that area in Paris where the Impressionists found their subject matter. It has Greece, Italy, and the Batignolles all rolled into one, as well as the sea." And in April 1921, Renoir's watercolor landscapes were seen for the first time by the public in Paris. 31 were included in the retrospective of 156 works on paper that were shown at Jean Rouel's gallery in Paris. Ours is a smaller exhibition, but it's on for longer. This exhibition in Jean Rouel's gallery lasted for 2 weeks, and basically did not achieve very much progress for Renoir. But nonetheless, it's a very important moment in the scholarship of his works on paper. For Renoir, there was general enthusiasm and sort of surprise, I think, around how these watercolors were made. One critic noted they were drawn with multiple and repeated touches of color that create stunning vibrations. Every sheet has its own spectrum, reduced in its essentials to the three primary colors of vermilion, azure, and gold. With such a restrained palette, Renoir achieves the rarest of harmonies. Now, in the last 2 decades of his life, crippling arthritis made it more and more difficult for Renoir to hold a pencil or crayon in his right hand. Yet he continued to draw in a variety of media and in a range of formats. He still made numerous quite detailed preparatory studies for his figure paintings and sculptures. He did large nudes, voluptuous and monumental large nudes in red and white chalk. He would continue on an enormous scale here in a red and white chalk drawing after a painting, and this drawing belonged to Picasso. And then there's the interesting challenge of looking at painting and drawing of the same subject. This lovely painting and lovely drawing of Hélène Belot, a young woman who was going out with the local postmaster in Cagnes and who sat for Renoir a few times. If we look closely, it's not clear which comes first. In my opinion, the painting was made first and the drawing, red and white chalk drawing, was made following it. "You know how hard it is for him to hold a pen," Gabrielle, his housekeeper, reported in 1908. "It's only his paintbrushes that he is able to handle comfortably." Another friend, the painter André, also attributed Renoir's preference for black and red chalk as media that were more tender than graphite to the artist's infirmities. Even these became challenging to manipulate in his last years. André wrote, 2 years after Renoir died, the deformities in his hands made it increasingly difficult for him to hold such fragile and breakable media as pastel and charcoal between his fingers. And yet, as we can see from this beautiful drawing from Philadelphia, there is no falling off in quality in the red and black chalk drawings that were made after 1900. In 1914, Renoir was delighted with the commission to make a portrait of the sculptor Auguste Rodin, who was a great fan of Renoir's work, and a painting of a nude that that Rodin owned by Renoir is in our exhibition. Renoir was delighted to be able to complete this commission and charged a hefty 1,000 francs. Rodin was a great admirer, and after much back and forth, Renoir drew him in Cagnes-sur-Mer on March the 7th, 1914, in less than an hour. Rodin was on a tight schedule and had a car and driver waiting. Renoir's vigorous red chalk and white chalk drawing, which we borrowed from a private collection, conveys what so captivated him in the sculptor himself. As Renoir noted, this was a face in which there is something of both Jupiter and a CEO. And I think that's a very good description of this wonderful drawing. For Georges Rivière, one of Renoir's most reliable biographers, the artist now hardly made any preparatory drawings at all. but I think this is an overstatement. Certain drawings that resemble the figures in his paintings were in fact executed afterwards. They can best be understood as a sort of correction or variation of the pose of the painted figure rather than a preparatory study for it. And this very interesting drawing from the Art Institute of Chicago on the left is in fact a tracing after the painting of the same subject at the Barnes collection to scale, almost looking like a Picasso from the 1920s. It is Renoir's way of recalling and perhaps reutilizing ideas that he's already completed in paint. Nonetheless, Renoir's continued to make spirited and movemented, passionate sketches in red and black chalk for some of his compositions. And we almost feel that he's not concerned at all about what the final appearance of the drawing is going to look like. This energy in trying to focus on different figures, different poses, and different lighting. Now, Renoir's drawings and sketches in various graphic media were rarely seen by the public during his lifetime. In 1892, an anonymous writer noted that as a draftsman, Renoir was just as convincing as he was a painter. His drawing is alive, animated, intelligent. It has infinite subtlety and delicacy. But far away from the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia, in 1902, Gauguin, thinking back about the artists he admired most, wrote, "To know how to draw is not the same as drawing well. In Renoir's art, nothing is in place. Do not look for line, it does not exist. As if by magic, a pretty patch of color, a caressing light, say all that is needed. Divine Renoir, a painter who has never learned to draw, but who draws well." In the decade before his death, in 1919, reproduction of Renoir's drawings began to appear as illustrations in various publications, even though the drawings were rarely discussed or analyzed in these books. They proliferated on the pages of Ambrose Vollard's Catalogue raisonné and his introduction to Renoir's life and career, where they decorate many pages and illuminate many as frontispieces and end pieces. Renoir was definitely involved in this project. He admired Vollard's enthusiasm for his works on paper. He made these drawings possible for Vollard to reproduce. Renoir, in fact, shortly before his death, noted that he approved of many of these illustrations, noting to Vollard, "You have made more of sketches than I understood of no significance, than of things of much greater importance. Je suis enchanté, I am enchanted." He couldn't recall the dates of his drawings, but as he said to Vollard the following year, and we have Renoir's self-portrait dedicated to Vollard and a drawing from the Musée du Grand Siècle to end with, as he said to Vollard, "It is impossible for me to provide you with the dates of these sketches. They were done between two sessions to capture movement. Faites entre deux séances pour chercher les mouvements." This is perhaps the most succinct explanation for Renoir's improvisatory manner of drawing that we have. Thank you very much.